Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 3. American History, 1800 through the Civil War. Part 2. Territorial Expansion and Arguments about Slavery. In the early 1800s, since the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, did not prohibit slavery, in practice, whether slavery was considered illegal or legal in any given state was left up to the state governments. Many politicians and lawyers of the time argued that because slavery was not prohibited by the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention, legal decisions about slavery should continue to be left up to individual state governments. They pointed to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which are called the Bill of Rights, to back up their argument. The final article of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, says that states are allowed whatever decision-making powers the Constitution doesn't specify belong to the federal government. Throughout U.S. history, lawmakers in different states have made very different decisions about issues that are not mentioned in the Constitution. In the early 1800s, after Whitney's cotton gin led to a boom in plantation slave labor, state governments in the South passed laws in favor of expanding slavery. By that time, by contrast, 8 state governments in the North had passed legislation outlawing or restricting slavery. Civics Test Question. What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the name we give to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The 10th Amendment, about the powers of state governments, is the final article of the Bill of Rights. As state governments made increasingly different laws about slavery, the social divide between the North and the South grew. States with governments that made laws abolishing or restricting slavery within their borders were known as free states. As the United States expanded westward, many new free states were added in the northern part of the country. Despite being called free states, most states with laws restricting slavery didn't immediately free everyone working as slaves. Instead, the governments of most free states enacted gradual abolition of slavery, making it illegal for people to be kept in slavery only if they were past a certain age, or if they had been born after a certain date. This is why the census map for 1850 shows that some people in New Jersey, for example, were still living in slavery after it became a free state. Still, as more states in the North passed laws restricting slavery, the slave trade became a topic of frequent debate at the federal level of U.S. government. Senators and House representatives argued about whether they should create national laws ending slavery. Many pro-slavery groups in the South began to worry that pro-abolition congressmen would eventually win the debate and the federal government would make slavery illegal throughout the nation. Some Southerners claimed that if the federal government made laws against slavery, it would be taking away the 10th Amendment rights of states that wanted to make laws keeping slavery. Southern states that wanted slavery to remain legal were called slave states. In the 1800s, some landowners and businessmen in slave states saw the federal government as a threat. Plantation owners and other Americans in the South said that if the federal government took away state governments' rights to decide about the issue of slavery, it would be like when the British government denied the 13 original colonies the right to self-government. Even though Southern states had senators and representatives in Congress, many Southerners felt that the federal government was too powerful. They worried that lawmakers from the North would make many decisions unpopular with Southern landowners, particularly about the slave trade. People who held this opinion said that fighting a war to keep slavery legal would be worth it. They compared the situation of the South to the situation of the American colonies that had been under British rule. Even though slavery was not one of the problems that led to the Revolutionary War, some Southerners said that taking a stand against the U.S. government in the 1800s would be similar to what the Founding Fathers had done when they'd adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence had said the United States is free from Great Britain. Now, in the 1800s, some groups in the South were considering making a similar declaration. This time, however, the South would be saying it was free from the United States. This political cartoon from the 1860s was drawn by a Southerner who wanted the slave states to declare independence from the United States. The depiction of the slave states as a snake is based on a famous cartoon Benjamin Franklin had published almost 100 years earlier to encourage the colonies to work together for freedom from British rule. In the 1700s, the colonists had fought the British because they didn't have self-government. The artist of the later cartoon believed that the Bill of Rights gave state governments the power to make their own laws about slavery. He suspected, however, that the U.S. government was going to go against the 10th Amendment as he understood it and take away slave states' rights to make these kinds of decisions. In publishing this picture, the artist was encouraging people who wanted to keep slavery to fight for independence from the U.S. government. When this cartoon was published, slave states in the USA included some of the original 13 states, such as South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Other slave states had joined the United States later as the country added more land to the territory under its control. New slave states included Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and many others located in the southern region of the country. Disputes between slave states and free states eventually led to a bloody civil war fought between the North and the South of the United States. This map shows the division between slave states and free states in the USA in 1850, about 10 years before the Civil War began. Around this time, government officials from the North and from the South often argued with each other about states' rights. Most of the arguments about states' rights had to do with whether state governments should have the power to make their own laws about slavery. For economic reasons, there was much more slavery in the South than in the North, and lawmakers in the North were more inclined to restrict slavery, while lawmakers in the South wanted to expand it. Arguments about slavery and about states' rights, along with economic reasons, led to the Civil War. Civics test question: why did the colonists fight the British? Why did the colonists fight the British? Because they didn't have self-government. People living in the 13 original colonies did not have the right to make their own laws. They fought the British to gain self-government. Later, even though they had representation in Congress and could vote for president, Americans in the South in the 1800s compared their situation to that of the colonists under British rule. Civics test question: when was the Declaration of Independence adopted? When was the Declaration of Independence adopted? July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was adopted by representatives of the 13 original colonies on the 4th of July in the year 1776. Civics test question: what did the Declaration of Independence do? What did the Declaration of Independence do? Announced our independence from Great Britain. The Declaration of Independence said the United States is free from Great Britain. In the 1800s, some Americans in the South talked about making a second Declaration of Independence, this time to say the South was free from the United States. But the reasons they had for wanting to leave the United States were different from the reasons that the colonists had for fighting the British. Civics test question: Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Slavery. Slavery is one problem that led the South to fight the North in the Civil War. Many people in the South also claimed that they were fighting for states' rights. The Civil War was also fought for economic reasons. The enormous economic differences between the North and the South in the 1800s encouraged state governments to create different laws and pushed business owners in different regions to support different stances on slavery. In the 1800s, a big issue that lawmakers from the North and from the South frequently argued about was what should happen in U.S. territories. As you can see on this mid-19th century map of the United States, many parts of the USA in 1850 were neither slave states nor free states. These areas of the country were not states at all. They were territories. Even though these territories were officially a part of the United States, they didn't have senators or voting representatives in the House of Representatives. In 1850, the government had not yet decided whether slavery would be legal or illegal in the territories. Just like they argued about the powers of state governments, lawmakers in Congress argued about whether territorial governments should make decisions about slavery for themselves, or whether the federal government should be the one to set the rules about slavery for every new piece of land the United States acquired. To try to stop the North and the South from fighting, Congress made several compromises that expanded slavery in Southern territories and restricted slavery in Northern territories. These compromises were not successful in stopping the arguing, however. After each compromise, what mainly happened was that Americans who wanted slavery to be abolished everywhere grew more and more angry that Congress was letting it expand in Southern territories, while Americans who wanted slavery to be permitted everywhere grew more and more angry about Congress restricting slavery in Northern territories. You may be wondering how all these territories were added to the United States in the first place. A major event that contributed to the country's growth in size in the 1800s was the purchase of what was known as the Louisiana Territory. This international deal was made around the start of the 19th century. To be more specific, in 1803, the U.S. government bought a huge piece of land called Louisiana from the French government. At the time of this deal, Thomas Jefferson was the President of the United States. Jefferson was a very influential founding father. He was the main writer of the Declaration of Independence. After the United States succeeded in becoming an independent nation, Jefferson was elected as the country's third president. One power of the president is to sign treaties, and in 1803, Jefferson signed a treaty with France buying the Louisiana Territory. Congress has the power to reject treaties signed by the president, but in this case there was no rejection. The Senate and the House of Representatives were happy to approve the Louisiana Purchase because they considered the deal to be a very good one for the United States. Adding the Louisiana Territory to the area under U.S. control doubled the size of the country on paper. The Louisiana Territory included not only most of what's now the state of Louisiana in the South, but also large parts of 14 other present-day states, stretching all the way up to Canada, as well as a small section of land currently on the other side of the Canadian border. As soon as Jefferson signed his deal with France in 1803, thousands of people from U.S. states on the East Coast began moving into the territory in search of economic opportunity. With the Louisiana Purchase came access not only to land, but also to important waterways. Even today, the Mississippi and the Missouri are the longest rivers in the USA. Both flow through the region corresponding to the Louisiana Territory. The Mississippi starts near the Canadian border and runs all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico, also now known as the Gulf of America, while the Missouri starts in what's now the western United States and flows eastward to connect with the Mississippi. In a time before cars, trucks, or planes, these rivers were frequently used to speedily transport goods and passengers from one part of the growing United States to another. During the Industrial Revolution, steamships and other newly invented ways of traveling on the water made transportation by river a major part of the U.S. economy. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers were also important sources of fresh water for drinking, washing, crop irrigation, and so on. Long before the Louisiana Purchase, these rivers had been used for such purposes by people who'd been living in the area for many centuries before Europeans were even aware the Americas existed. From 1803 onward, the westward movement of settlers from eastern U.S. states and the expansionist policies of the U.S. government resulted in many conflicts and disputes with Native Americans living near the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. Native American tribes based in the area the French named Louisiana had no say in the treaty France made with the U.S., but after the treaty was signed, they were told their homelands now belonged to the United States. Pictured here are some notable Native American people born in the 1800s who lived in what we now call South Dakota, Kansas, and Oklahoma, modern-day states that fall within the borders of the Louisiana Territory. Sitka Lasha was a musician and a Native American and women's rights activist of the Sioux, or the Dakota, people. White Plume was a Kaw Nation leader, and John Wilson was a Caddo medicine man. People of the Sioux, Kaw, and Caddo nations, as well as thousands of other Native American or American Indian people living in the Mississippi and Missouri River areas in the 1800s, were personally impacted by U.S. government decisions like the Louisiana Purchase. They witnessed many of the effects of the Industrial Revolution, of U.S. westward expansion, and of the Civil War firsthand. Civics test question: who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? Who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? American Indians. Before Europeans arrived in North and South America, American Indians, or Native Americans, lived throughout these continents. Civics test question: name one American Indian tribe in the United States. Name one American Indian tribe in the United States. Sioux. There are many tribes in the United States which officially go by the name Sioux. Most members of Sioux tribes in the present day live in South Dakota, Nebraska, or Minnesota, states corresponding to areas of land that were added to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase. Other American Indian tribes traditionally based around the Mississippi and Missouri rivers include the Kaw and the Caddo nations. Civics test question: what territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? Louisiana. The United States bought Louisiana, or the Louisiana Territory, from France in 1803. Civics test question: name one of the two longest rivers in the United States. Name one of the two longest rivers in the United States. The Mississippi. The two longest rivers in the United States are the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. In the 19th century, as the federal government of the United States added Louisiana and other territories to the area under its control, Mexican and U.S. military forces clashed repeatedly over ownership of land in western North America. In 1845, the United States annexed, or officially took over, Texas. A few years later, after many battles between the U.S. and Mexican armies, the Mexican government signed a peace treaty giving up several other territories to the United States government. As can be seen on the map, the United States now stretched across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west. In 1853, another treaty between the U.S. and Mexican governments, called the Gadsden Purchase, added yet more previously Mexico-controlled territory to the United States and created the southern border we have today. Going by present-day political boundaries, there are 4 U.S. states that share a border with Mexico. From east to west, the 4 modern U.S. states that border Mexico are Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Civics test question. What ocean is on the west coast of the United States? What ocean is on the west coast of the United States? The Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is on the west coast of the United States. Since the end of the Mexican-American War, the political boundaries of the U.S. have reached all the way to the Pacific. Civics test question. What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? The Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean is on the east coast of the United States. The original 13 states were all on the east coast, next to the Atlantic. Other states were added to the country later as a result of international treaties and wars. Civics test question. Name one state that borders Mexico. Name one state that borders Mexico. Texas. Texas is one state that borders Mexico. The 4 states that border Mexico are California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. In Texas and in most other territories added to the United States in the South in the 1800s, the slave trade was at first legal. As the United States expanded westward and slavery expanded with it, however, anti-slavery feeling grew in many cities and towns of the United States. People who wanted to end or abolish slavery often argued that it was an inhumane activity. They pointed out that the slave trade made a practice of ripping families apart. They said that until abolition was achieved, the United States would be going against its own supposed founding principles in denying enslaved people many basic rights the Constitution was supposed to guarantee all Americans. People who worked to abolish slavery were called abolitionists. Some abolitionists, like the political writer and public speaker Maria W. Stewart, were Black people who had been born in free states in the 1800s. Stewart was born in Hartford, Connecticut. As a young woman, she left the Connecticut state capital and moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where she wrote for an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, which featured anti-slavery material like the illustration you see here. Stewart and many other Black abolitionists in the North were not enslaved themselves, but they were nonetheless frequently denied basic rights white Americans had by law. They contended with many forms of racism that were prevalent even in free states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, as they fought to make their opinions on slavery and other issues heard. Also in the 1800s, more and more white Americans were drawn to the abolitionist cause for moral, religious, and political reasons. Another Connecticut abolitionist who, like Maria W. Stewart, used writing as a way to push for an end to slavery was a white woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Even though she was a white U.S. citizen, Stowe could not vote. Women in Connecticut were not given the right to vote until 1920, decades after Stowe had died of old age. Despite being unable to participate in elections, however, Stowe petitioned the government and the American public for change through her work as an author. She is most famous today for a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin that describes the terrible conditions under which many enslaved people were living in the United States. Although this book is a work of fiction, it vividly depicted how even children were sold into slavery and how families were broken apart by the practice. American enslavers said Stowe's novel was unrealistic, but Uncle Tom's Cabin quickly became a bestseller in the US and in Great Britain. It successfully turned many white people against slavery. Because of Stowe's influence as an abolitionist writer in the 1800s, her old house in Hartford has been turned into a museum you can visit today. Other people who worked for abolition in the 1800s wrote and spoke from their direct personal experience of having been enslaved. Frederick Douglass, for instance, grew up in slavery in Maryland. He escaped as a young man and became one of the best known abolitionist speakers in the country. His essays and speeches inspired other people, black and white, to join the abolitionist movement and to petition the U.S. government to outlaw slavery. In 1838, the British Empire abolished slavery in its Caribbean colonies, partly thanks to the influence of internationally known American abolitionists like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass. That year, there were more than 1,300 abolitionist organizations all around the United States pushing for U.S. Congress to make the same kind of change to the law, and 2 million Americans signed anti-slavery petitions. But as lawmakers in the American South pushed back against abolitionist activity, the abolition movement was still considered controversial. Some of the rising tensions between free states and slave states during this time can be attributed to the Underground Railroad and the Fugitive Slave Acts. The Underground Railroad was not literally a subterranean train track. Instead, it was a series of secret routes and safe hideaways that abolitionists used to help tens of thousands of enslaved people escape to free states and territories, as well as to Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Although thousands used the Underground Railroad to escape their enslavers, in the 1700s and early 1800s, enslaved people were classified as property by the federal government no matter where they ran. The Constitution contained a clause requiring that anyone who broke state law by fleeing their place of labor be returned on request to the person from whom they had escaped, even if the runaway laborer had made it to a free state or territory. However, especially as the abolitionist movement gained energy, the general population of many northern states refused to comply with this clause. Some states in the North even passed laws that directly contradicted the constitutional clause about returning enslaved people to the places from which they had escaped. In response, Congress passed Fugitive Slave Acts in the late 1700s and mid 1800s that gave so called slave owners greater powers to retrieve people who had used the Underground Railroad to escape. The Fugitive Slave Acts also created punishments for anyone in the United States assisting a person trying to escape from slavery. Abolitionists fiercely protested these acts. As popular opinion on slavery grew more fiercely divided, political parties split on the issue. Government officials and two of the largest parties at the time, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, hotly argued with their colleagues over whether the Fugitive Slave Acts were acceptable and over whether slavery should be allowed in new territories of the United States, such as Louisiana and Texas. As a result of these sorts of disagreements, a new party called the Republican Party was created. Members of the Republican Party were abolitionists. Republicans in the 1800s were trying to get laws passed that would abolish or at least restrict slavery in the United States. Whig abolitionists eventually left the Whig Party to join the Republican Party. Democratic abolitionists followed suit. While this was happening, a new Democratic Party was formed that was anti-abolition. Politicians in the Whig Party and in the old Democratic Party, who wanted the governments of states and of territories to have the power to make their own decisions about slavery, joined the new Democratic Party. The Whig Party and the old Democratic Party both came to an end. As a result of fierce disagreements about slavery, the Whig Party had collapsed entirely, which is why we don't hear about Whig politicians in the news today. The Republican Party and the new Democratic Party were now the major political parties in the United States. Since this shakeup, the United States has continued to have two major parties dominating the political stage. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party have remained the two major political parties in this country into the present day. Of course, in modern times, neither party is anti-abolition. Republicans and Democrats are now divided on other issues. Civics test question. What are the two major political parties in the United States? What are the two major political parties in the United States? The Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The two major political parties in the United States are the Democratic and Republican parties.